going to get started right now. Scott Pace, the Director of Space Policy Institute, is going to be giving the introductory remarks, and then we're just going to go right into the panel. We'll have Q&A afterwards, so folks that are joining us via Zoom can just send in their questions, and I'll curate them from the chat. And then folks in the audience, if you have questions during the Q&A section, just raise your hand. There's microphones above you, so just please project when you do ask the questions. So Scott, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Aaron. Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you all for being here, both in person and online. I was just commenting before this, was watching a live transmission of the Japanese Hakuto rover trying to land on the moon. It's on the surface, whether it's communicating is another problem. So our sort of tense at the moment for our Japanese friends. So first of all, the space and cybersecurity topic, okay, certainly is a hot one. I mean, as we were setting up for this session, I informally counted about a half dozen different events as we were, preparing for this one from a variety of places: academia, nonprofits, government, industry, associations. So it's certainly gone from obscurity to popularity in a few years. Since the release of Space Policy Directive 5 in September of 2020, on cybersecurity principles for space systems, there's been an increasing level of both technical and business activity focused on cybersecurity of space systems. To a large extent, this attention, of course, we think is overdue. And when you consider the massive amount of dependencies both we and the rest of the world have on space systems, so the risks of both intentional and unintentional interference are sufficient to cause concern. If you're putting resources against risks, we have risks to cover. SPD 5 rightly recognized that, like the internet, the problems before us are multi-stakeholder. That is, no one, government, industry, or academia, has a monopoly on wisdom, and thus we should be humble about what we don't know, and humble about learning from the experiences of others, and listen to those who are closest to the operational reality. That is, taking a more of a bottom-up approach to finding solutions versus trying to impose solutions top-down. Again, taking the adage that no one has a monopoly on wisdom. The bottom-up approach, I think, needs to be combined with a comprehensive understanding of the cyber threat environment and defensive architectures. We need to pay attention to how space systems are actually operated, the hardware and software that goes into them, and who is allowed to interact with them. That is, software, hardware, operational practice, people are all important to cybersecurity in space, no less than on the ground. Gone are the days when you could simply load an antivirus program and think you're done. The good news is that we're not alone in these concerns. At the recent G7 meeting in Japan, April 18th this month, the foreign minister's communique said, quote, "We support an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure cyberspace. We are concerned about growing cyberspace threats and remain committed to countering challenges and promoting the rule of law in cyberspace. We encourage all states to deepen substantive discussion on how existing international law, including the UN Charter, apply to cyberspace. We are determined to implement regional and global confidence building measures, promote internationally established voluntary and non-legally binding norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and enhance capacity building efforts. We are steadfast in disseminating existing international cooperation frameworks for investigation and prosecution and contributing to ongoing efforts to combat cyber crime." And of course, all these principles apply to space as well. Now, the United States recognizes that cybersecurity is a concern of many countries, hence the international composition of this panel. Earlier this month, there was a joint press release from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency under DHS, along with FBI, NSA, and cyber authorities of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United Kingdom, Germany, and the Netherlands. The occasion was a publication of, quote, "Secure by Design and Default Principles and Approaches." Now, not limited to space, this joint guidance, quote, "urges software manufacturers to take urgent steps necessary to ship products that are secure by design and default, to create a future where technology and associated products are safe for customers." The authoring agencies urge manufacturers to revamp their design and development programs to permit only secure by design and default products to be shipped to customers. I wonder if that applies to beta versions, but among its principles, the guidance to software manufacturers is: one, take ownership of security outcome of their technology products. emphasis here, shifting the burden of security from the customers. So the manufacturers taking much more of a responsibility rather than just depending on you all to absorb the risk and install that antivirus software. A secure configuration should be the default baseline in which products are automatically enabled the most important security controls needed to protect the enterprise from malicious cyber actors. Second, enable radical transparency and accountability, for example, by ensuring vulnerability advisories and associated common vulnerability and exposure records are complete and accurate. Easier said than done. Now, of course, I doubt this will stop the need for bug fixes and regular security updates, but hopefully common action can lower the rate and severity of cyber intrusions and again, be less intrusive on the user. Similar measures will be needed, of course, as commercial activity expands into space. The US space community is responding, and I should note the initiative by IEEE to form a standards development group. This group, of course, is initially focused on commercial off-the-shelf equipment, but with increasing government use of commercial systems, it will be hard to sustain, I think, a bright line between what is government and what is commercial in space. Space Policy Directive 1 calls for international and private sector partnership in the return to the moon and future missions to Mars. Cyber systems will obviously be a part of the exploration and development of space, and thus cybersecurity will be a top priority of those systems. Now, one of the most exciting developments I personally have been involved in, so I think it's exciting, is an effort to build an interplanetary solar system-wide internet. We know that current internet protocols will not work in space, and that new techniques will be needed. The time delays inherent in deep space communications means that TCP/IP and your favorite system will time out long before a message will arrive. Now, as an analogy, think of today's internet as driving from here to New York. There are roads and signs, and it would actually take a bit of effort, although it can be done, to get lost. On the other hand, imagine going from here to Jakarta. You need to get to the airport, catch a plane, make a connection, perhaps several, before arriving and then traveling to your hotel. Similarly, a message traveling on a solar system internet has to deal with time delays, planetary motion, differing time standards. Effort would be needed to align Earth time with lunar time or wherever else you were, or indeed anywhere in the solar system due to gravity, general relativistic effects for those of you who recall physics, and motion, special relativistic effects for those of you who recall. Now, fortunately, since about 1999, the last 20 years, potential technical solutions have been known. These include delay tolerant networking and bundled protocols. We know that DTN works. It's been demonstrated in space. And I believe it's the future of deep space communication. Certainly going to be the future of, I think, the LunaNet that NASA is currently working on. So just as IP version 6 is the future for the terrestrial internet, bundled protocol, not dependent on IP, but can run over IP as well as other future link layers, is the future, I believe, for the space solar system internet. Now, perhaps to the relief of many in this room, I will not go into technical details here. Suffice to say, though, that the solar system internet will have security challenges, just as today's internet does. Unfortunately, we have the opportunity to design in security and best practices from the beginning and to learn from the past. I look forward to today's discussion, and thank you again for joining us today. I think a cautionary adage here, to borrow a phrase from some of our military colleagues, no one is coming. It's up to us. We're on our own here. If take a moment to do the example.
Yes, please do.
So just for fun, as an exercise for the audience, I was on a discussion the other day with a number of people working on solar system internet, including Vince Cerf, who some of you may recognize from the formation of TCP/IP. And he came up with an example that he shared with the group as kind of a thought problem and challenge. So let's starting with this example. Let's assume Moonbase Alpha has been established, say 2026, and has an operational DTN network. Ready Hacker 1, a group of well-known ransomware hackers, has decided that it's a big opportunity to hold Moonbase Alpha hostage by attacking its systems through the DTN network. It's managed to hack into the email account of a legitimate DTN user, Alfred E. Newman. Sadly, Newman's password was "what me worry." And somehow the RH1 group guessed it and sent a phishing email to Newman, who stupidly clicked on the included URL and downloaded malware into his laptop. The malware allowed RH1 to gain access to Newman's account, which he used to send a malicious email to Buzz Lightyear, buzz@moonbasealpha.moon.sol.int, that included a link to more malware. Since the message sent to Buzz came from Newman, whom Buzz recognized as a friend, he opened the email and clicked on the link in the message. Buzz's laptop became infected with a ransomware exploit that downloaded to a hidden app that uses Buzz's laptop to access local Moonbase Alpha servers containing station operational files, configurations, and the like. Newman then threatens Artemis 1 mission participants with a shutdown of Moonbase Alpha, saying that unless payment is made within 24 hours, the configuration file needed to keep the Moonbase operational will be automatically encrypted, rendering Moonbase Alpha non-operational, including life support systems. RH1 has set up a cron job, those who may recognize a Linux command tasking sequence, to auto-encrypt these critical files unless stopped by command from RH1. What provisions of the DTN networks and the operational standards of DP version 7 and others related standards would defend against this kind and other related scenarios? So have that in your background as you think about what would you do to protect against this, and what you do to recover from it should it occur. With that, I turn it over to Aaron.
Thank you, Scott. All right, so now we're going to get into the panel. So it's my pleasure to introduce the international panel of experts. Firstly, Gil Barham. She's an affiliate of Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation, as well as the University of California, San Diego. Melissa Griffith, who's a senior lecturer in technology and national security, Johns Hopkins University here in DC, and Neil Sherman Petty, who's the head of space security and enterprise security at BAE Systems Digital Intelligence, and was formerly the deputy head of information assurance at the UK Foreign Office. So I think we're going to have a very good discussion on international perspectives on this very timely issue of the nexus of space and cybersecurity. So how we're going to do this is we're going to go through. All the panelists are going to give introductory remarks on what they see as the most pressing issues at the nexus of space and cybersecurity, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So Gil, let's start off with you, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I think it's a very important issue, and I'm glad we have the chance to discuss it. So, today, like in the next 8 to 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about 3 main issues that I think present the current and the potential concerns, as well as opportunities in the intersection of cybersecurity and space. So first, I'll discuss the growth of the threats coming from China and Russia, including their advances in technology and the potential consequences of their offensive cyber capabilities to space. The second issue I would like to address is the issue of cybersecurity for the private space sector, including the unique challenges this sector faces. And finally, to try and end up in a more optimistic way, I would like to briefly mention and discuss the importance of the international cooperation in mitigating these risks in this interconnected space cybersecurity environment. So the first concern I would like to draw our attention to is, as I think we all already familiar with, is the growing range of threats coming especially from China and Russia. Both countries have made significant advances in their space technology in recent years, including space lasers, on-orbit proximity capabilities, and anti-satellite capabilities. In addition, they have successfully penetrated by using offensive cyber operations to many aerospace companies, and were able to damage satellite networks by conducting offensive cyber operations, which is a worrying trend for the US, but also for other countries, as we all depend on space systems and the internet infrastructure for communication and for our everyday lives. And to emphasize the importance of the threat, let me cite things that Lieutenant General John Shaw, the Deputy Commander of US Space Command, said last month. He said that we're under threat in the space domain. If I were on the general staff of Russia, or if I was serving in the PLA with China's People's Liberation Army, I would be advising the leadership to go after the space capabilities of the United States. The militarization of space systems is a growing concern, and countries seek to develop space-based weapons to gain military advantage. But cyber attacks can be used to compromise these kind of weapon systems and potentially causing physical damage or even leading to armed conflict in space. For instance, the Russian military tested an anti-satellite system in space in 2020, which could potentially be used to disable or destroy satellites belonging to other countries. While no cyber attacks were recorded in relation to this test, the militarization of space systems is a growing concern for cybersecurity experts. China is using sophisticated techniques to build space system defenses, including social engineering, advanced malware, and supply chain attacks. For example, the Chinese hacking group known as APT-10 targeted several Indian organizations, including the Indian Space Research Organization, in January 2021. This hacking group also targeted several satellite and telecommunication companies in the United States and Europe, stealing sensitive technical data related to the company's products and services. And just last week, it was reported in some of the information that was leaked that China was building cyber weapons that will enable it to hijack its enemy satellites. So we can see that the militarization of space is on the rise, and cybersecurity capabilities can play a significant role for defense and offense as well. The second issue I would like to raise is cybersecurity threat to the private space sector. The number of private space companies is growing around the world, not just in the United States. And the war in Ukraine demonstrated the importance of the commercial space industry and its effectiveness in communication and remote sensing by rapidly adapting to the conflict, as we saw in the Russian cyber attacks against Viasat and the resilience of SpaceX Starlink. The private space sector has become increasingly important in times of war, especially due to its ability to provide critical support to military operation. As the US Air Force Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs said last week, that the war also reinforced our need to protect and defend commercial space assets. With this increased reliance on private space companies comes the need for better cybersecurity standards and protection. The private space sector is vulnerable to cyber attacks, which can have severe consequences for national security as well. Space system contractors and suppliers are often targeted by cyber attackers to gain access to space system networks, while insider threats pose a significant concern for space systems as well, as employees and contractors with access to sensitive information and systems can be a source of intentional or unintentional security breaches. At the beginning of the month, as was mentioned, the Cybersecurity Solarium Commission recommended that the space systems should be considered as critical infrastructure. They argue that designating the space sector as critical infrastructure also has a signaling value. It tells people, both domestically and internationally, that space security and resilience is important. And lastly, I would like to address the importance of international cooperation. The international community needs to come together to establish common cybersecurity best practices to protect the critical space assets. This is particularly important given the increasing number of private companies and nations involved in and operating in space. And to many of them, they don't share the same level of cybersecurity expertise. There are several efforts along these lines, including within the ITU and the NIST introduction framework to cybersecurity for commercial satellite operations. There is a need to establish the security by design practices for space systems as well, so they could be accepted by various space companies and nations. There are also parallel efforts to establish cyber norms within the UN to define what acceptable behavior in cyberspace is. And we should ask that about the nexus of cyber and space as well. And as the Biden administration also supports the Paris call for trust and security in cyberspace, which is a voluntary commitment to work with the international community to advance cybersecurity and preserve the open and reliable internet. This kind of global effort should take space assets into concern as well. And by working together and establishing common best practices, the international community can better protect the critical assets in space and mitigate the risks of cyber threats to space systems, which are crucial for our everyday lives. And we just saw that how crucial they are during conflict times, as we saw in Ukraine. I will stop here and I look forward for the discussion.
Thank you, Gil. Melissa, over to you.
Thank you. So first, thank you to George Washington University and Scott for those excellent opening remarks. I feel like we could have probably all gone home at the end of those, but I will strive to do my best pushing forward. Thank you, Erin, for having me, and Gil, thank you for teaming me up so nicely with your comments. I think there's a lot of things there that I would sort of double rubber stamp on my way through as important points. So I guess as I'm thinking about this space, I have sort of two sets of concerns that ride in my brain. One is, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? What are the sets of challenges? And the others are sort of, what are pathways forward, solution sets that we can kind of talk through and problematize. On the problem side, I think it's worth asking, is there something different here than all of the sort of previous concerns we've had around space and space-based architectures historically? And I think there's three things that make this moment more troublesome, maybe keep us up a little bit more late at night than we would otherwise have been. And the first is this growing dependence, so the growing dependence on these systems. The second is that is an increasingly contested space. We'll talk about each of these sort of in turn. And the third is that the diversity of players and assets is really changing. We're getting a proliferation and diversification function there, both in terms of the players themselves, industry, private, government, and also what we're actually putting in the space. And those three things are kind of concerning, but also exciting trend lines. So though you may leave this talk today, I think, being a little terrified, I also want to emphasize that we're not sort of doing this just for terror. There's a lot of good benefits to a lot of this activity that we're seeing in space. So we're trying to manage those benefits while also mitigating those risks. So let's take those in turn. The dependence on space-based assets. It can feel very sort of out there, right? As we're thinking about the scenario, if you're not Artemis, if you're not on this mission set, if you're not on the moon, why should I care about these if I'm not on the ISS, the International Space Station? And the reality is almost everything you are doing in terms of getting to campus today, turning on lights, making phone calls, having electricity and water, all of those things are dependent on space-based systems. So that dependence has never been higher. That includes supervisory control systems, which like ICF control systems at scale across large territories. It's how our ships talk to each other. It's increasingly how you do phone calls, how you're like, I'm trying to find this building and you're navigating on Google Maps, geo-positioning, all of those things rely on space. And that is only increasing. It's not just military use cases, which I think are important and worthy of discussing, but also civilian everyday use cases. So that's the dependency picture. We are far more dependent. We could pull all of those cases apart and sort of talk through them, but I want to keep that trend line is only going up. The second is this contestation component of the environment. And we are increasingly seeing a lot of movement here, and you could name any number of examples, whether you're looking at the International Space Station and being worried more about collaboration, cooperation as it relates to human life in orbit, that's starting to look a little bit more afraid. If you're looking at kind of increased militarization, which Gil pointed to, I think, quite expertly, the move in 2019 to include this as an operational domain for NATO, right? The pushes of cyber command, space force in this space as well, increasing militarization. Those are peacetime activities all the way to wartime activities, what we've seen in the wake of Ukraine. With the OneWeb sets of concerns, this is not a cyber operation, but it is a dependency and a big commercial company relying on Russian capability for launch, being unable to launch their assets into low Earth orbit, or a Viasat hack, which is focused very much on communications, particularly Ukrainian communications in the onset of the war, and also had a little bit of a cascading effect into wind turbines and wind farms in Germany, supervisory control systems on the ICS side. So we have this kind of array of sets of concerns, an array of increasingly contestation, whether they're hacking groups like APT-10 to sort of in military conflict zones across the board. So increasingly contested, starting to seem a little bit less cooperation heavy and a little bit more foot forward in that space, which is a concern. And then that third is saying the diversity of players and the diversity of assets are changing. So if you didn't think the first two are bad enough, the second two, these last two components are also pretty concerning. And traditionally, when we think about space, this is a high barrier to entry domain, so you expect a fairly limited group of actors to be operating. We're seeing that aperture widen fairly significantly to include a wide array of sort of university and education components with CubeSats to industry like OneWeb, Viasat, right, all the way to SpaceLink, Starlink, and SpaceX and components. So it's widening Project Kuiper, for example, in that area. That also changes what we put in space. Historically, if we were having this conversation 20 or so years ago, we would have a much smaller number of assets we would be talking about in very specific orbits. That's changing. We're not just talking about geosynchronous. That's the idea that it's high enough up when you look up, it's stationary in your sky, versus LEO, that's where the ISS is, the International Space Station, low Earth orbit. When you look up at night, you see it flying by. If you're something is flying by for coverage, you need large numbers. This is where we start to get those constellations. Those are very different assets, very different systems, very different ground stations and space-based assets, uplink, downlinks, as well as a diversity of players. So that's sort of the problem space we find ourselves in. What are some of the kind of things I would look at for the solution set? Because I like symmetry, I will talk about three. So I've given you three problems to think about. I'll talk about three things that are maybe food for thought. I think the first is a bit of a note of caution, which is to scope the policy conversation appropriately. So sometimes we get a little too far down into the technical weeds, and there are technical solution sets here. So for example, if you are an operator, it matters if you're running a transponded or a processor as your payload. One is you are literally hopping, right, just providing bandwidth, conduit. The other, you are actually processing something about that data in orbit and affecting that data in orbit. Those are two different security concerns. Policy is probably not going to weigh in on that very specific technical set of solutions, sort of bracketing some of these off. TCP IP protocols would be another set, right? We're looking for technical solutions versus much more broadly, what is the right role of government? How do we incentivize industry when we get market failures, right? This is that security by design conversation. I think it's important to notice and to kind of recognize in this space, some of these are domestic conversations and should be. What is sort of the appropriate footing for the United States? And some of these, when we talk about governance or regulatory structures or prevention, so sort of deterrence and normative-based conversations are inherently international. So sort of scoping this conversation correctly as we push forward, we're having a technical conversation, a policy conversation, where does that policy conversation fit in that landscape would be the sort of first introduction. I think the second is to not treat, recognizing I'm a cybersecurity person, and I have a sort of job interest in making my field seem as cool as possible. Let's not treat cybersecurity as a brand new set of problems, and particularly as we talk about space-based assets, because it feels very removed. So everyone's sort of like brand new challenge, brand new set of wheels, let's reinvent. A lot of the conversations that Gil was walking through, we could have dropped the word space and taught it in a cyber operations class. Right? A lot of this conversation is very much the same sets of challenges we've had before. So don't treat this as path breaking. Start to leverage some of the lessons we're already learning. And I'll give you a couple examples of those. One is that there's sort of three broad buckets that we should be concerned about. The architecture component is the physical component. It's not a coincidence when you're looking at exercises like Hackasat, they go after ground stations. The physical locations, the brains of these entities, you have this set of components. The digital layer component, just traditionally what we think about in cyber operations, where you're going after the confidentiality, integrity, availability of data, that CIA triad. And then the supply chain part of this conversation that cannot sort of be forgotten. This is a very high barrier to entry, low number of players space. So as you're looking at kind of points of leverage, sets of concerns around access, those are all conversations you have around critical infrastructure and cybersecurity writ large. We can port them over into the space, not some redundant, the space. The second that I think is really important here as we talk this through is not to make cybersecurity the end in and of itself. This is another kind of extension of this. It's not entirely unique. We only care about cybersecurity of these systems because we don't want them disrupted, denied, degraded, destroyed, or the confidentiality of the data on those systems tampered with in any way. Cyber operations are just merely one more tool in that toolkit. So ASAS, jamming, a series of other capabilities that could lead to those effects. So placing it in that context, if I want sustained, resilient systems, That's not just a cybersecurity conversation. Right? That is one toolkit, slightly different dynamics, but I'm looking at resilience at a system-wide level and how I can maintain assets in orbit. Same sets of conversations, so sort of placing them together. The third, and then I'll kind of hand it over for broader discussion and to hear kind of the broader panel, would be as we sort of play in this space, take advantage of the terrain and the way that the terrain is evolving. So there's a couple kind of fun things about cyberspace and space writ large, which is you can kind of pick the terrain upon which you operate, and you can pick it well. This is that security by design conversation, but it's also a lean into the different type of assets conversation kind of coming from me here, which is as we look at things like low Earth orbit, PLEO, proliferated low Earth orbit constellations, we can shift our thinking from these old models where we have a handful of satellites and geosynchronous, they're high up, there's a couple of them, they're legacy systems, they're going to operate for 20, 30 years. We have a lot of limited ability to replace and sort of troubleshoot on those assets. We're in maintenance game at that point. As we move to PLEO, we have rapidly changing. So these are 7-year life cycles, deorbiting up and down, large numbers of assets, highly commoditized hardware. So most of our functionality is at the software layer, which gives us a lot more flexibility, both in terms of payload and our ability to update. And we can customize their mission sets in orbit. These are all nice things. Taking those things together, the cost of launch, the shifting of those assets, we can move from this asset-based resilient security conversation. I have a handful of them. I have to engineer for them to survive at scale in a very hostile environment, not because there's malicious actors, but just because space is rough, right? So like I'm engineering for that environment to saying, I don't need to think about the asset. I can think about a constellation and engineer for my security and resilience as a built-in factor of numbers. That's a really good world to be in. You should take advantage of that and sort of leverage into that terrain conversation. So I think those would be my big three, thinking about where we scope this policy. Are we talking technical, national, up to the policy at the international level? The second being, please do not reinvent the wheel, right? As we're looking at these, we can port over a lot of lessons from previous spaces, both cybersecurity, critical infrastructure conversations. And the last being, let's lean into the advantages of the way that the space is changing, the way that space is changing, and build security and resilience with those advantages in mind.
Thank you, Melissa. All great points. Neil, over to you.
Thank you very much. And this is where I would say Paris is calling. So I apologize if any latency on the line. It's been a very long day for me, and I apologize if I try not to fall asleep during the session. It's a great honor to be talking to you. I probably come from a slightly different position to what you may do in sort of the academia or some of the other areas of the businesses. I'm actually a owner of not personally, but my organization, we actually have purchased a satellite manufacturing company. We are in the process of actually building, designing and launching our own military capability on behalf of BAE Systems. And we joined this process by going through acquisition. So you acquire a company to then do a migration to actually start building out and looking at them, bringing them along the journey with you. And it's quite quick to see as you do this sort of transition that as you're moving into the world of space, that actually is quite a complex one. BAE has a very long heritage. I mean, we've been in the space industry for multiple decades. We have things running on geostationary satellites now, which are used by ESA, which is the European Space Agency, for their STT&C communication links to get information from space to ground securely. We've got a long heritage of doing that, and what we're now obviously doing is building out our own new satellite capability. Being in Europe, and I'm now currently sat waiting to go to the CISAT conference, which is the European Space Satellite Hacker Conference, which also includes a hackathon as well, which takes place in Paris the next 2 days. And being sat here quite privileged, but we are very cognizant of being part of Europe, that things like the Ukrainian war were major impacts to the European infrastructure. The attack that Russia made to go after disabling the ground stations was one of the attacks which basically disabled not only the Ukrainian army, but also took out, as you mentioned, a lot of the infrastructure. So the wide areas of Europe were affected at the same time. In BAE Systems, what we actually did, we have a section to do with threat and intelligence reporting, and we actually sat down and reverse engineered the attack that the Russians had done to actually work out how they'd done it and actually to then inform governments. I'm very privileged. I also am the industry chair, of which is where in the UK, I think we may be slightly different position to you in the US, you yourselves in the US, etc. With the fact that we have we have our department called NCSC, which is the National Cybersecurity Centre, and our Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, which are two UK government bodies who were part of the group, the global report which mentioned at the beginning of the session. And I am the industry chair that sits on that panel where we have a space security information exchange where industry and government and military come together 4 times a year, where we actually physically sit there and we literally all our cards out on the tables. We talk about everything that's happened to us in industry. We talk about the attacks we're actually seeing on the ground rather than sort of being theoretical. We actually say, this is what's going on. And at the same time, we get targeted intelligence and threat reporting from our government colleagues in NCSC and CPNI, who are now renamed as NPSA, but that's a long story. The structural changes allow us to get the information in at the very beginning. And also from an industry side, we can sort of share information. I'll give you one thing that actually happened to me personally. Our program, which is called Azalea, was announced at Spacecom in the UK, which is located in Farnborough last September. And I was a panelist at Spacecom last year. And if we think about threats not being out there in the space industry, my name was publicized as being obviously head of space security for BAE Systems. And within 48 hours, I received 483 requests on LinkedIn to become a friend of mine. And when that information was passed across to our intelligence agencies, they actually inspected the accounts, and 3 of them were foreign intelligence officers. Two were Chinese and 1 was Russian, trying to befriend me to try and find out what information was going on from the inside. And it's when you sort of see that actually happening, you actually realise. So that was one of the sort of things we were actually seeing on the ground. But what we've done in BAE Systems is that I've actually taken a very hard line and I've integrated and ingrained security from day 1 of the program. So it's not a case of waiting till the 11th hour or checkpoint gate 11 or whatever you want to call it on Prince 2, whichever methodology we're following, TOGAF, etc. It's irrespective. The security is in the beginning. We set the policies, process, procedures. We actually developed our own NIST standards before NIST came out with the space controls because we couldn't wait for them. We actually helped informed the NIST controls because we couldn't wait for them to come out. And we've actually been working with our program. And one of the critical areas, and we're driving this across the UK at the moment, is embedding supply chain management. It's absolutely crucial. Companies today are constantly working in a situation where you are taking commercial off-the-shelf components. We're doing the same. You are not manufacturing all the cameras. You're not doing the RF. You're not doing the communication links. You're buying the components together and bolting them together to build a service to launch into space. We talk about secure by design. We've been doing that in the UK for nearly 5 years, over 5 years, especially in the defence environment. So we've been doing this by default. Everything you do is secure by design. But if you inappropriately bolt things together as part of your commercial off the shelf, so for example, if you have a camera and you load onto your platform to build out your LEO satellite, that if it was incorrectly implemented, could then lead to issues to your platform. And getting the message home, even have had this problem with inside BAE, trying to say people, okay, you've had a secure by design supplier issued you with something which is a proven item. When you put that on the platform, we still have to pen test that platform. We still have to go through doing assurance around that particular component to make sure we've not actually introduced any vulnerabilities. The second area is, and I apologise if there's any scripting people on the call. Quite often now people are getting quite lazy and complacent when it comes to actually developing code. You're using code libraries and just pulling code libraries in and actually using them rather than actually looking, what does this code library do? We have seen in the UK that the foreign intelligence agencies are using things like GitHub to try and actually inject code into actually circumventing your machine learning for the future. Our machine learning, it would be looking at satellite imagery and trying to say, okay, is this an aircraft carrier? Is this a cruise ship? Is this an airplane, etc.? If you can get into the machine learning and actually say, well, every time you see a Russian destroyer, change that to become a phishing vessel, you will then think it's a benign object. And it's how you actually make sure you go through and do the due diligence and the deep dive that the code is actually appropriate for what you're loading onto the platform. And that is obviously quite a large challenge when you've got tens of thousands, millions of lines worth of code to go through. It's building the due diligence in there to make sure you actually are reviewing that appropriately from the beginning. So supply chain with the coding base you're obviously using in your platform will then build you a secure by design platform. But the difference I see between what we're doing sort of enterprise security normally as a traditional approach, I've been doing security for nearly 30 years in the government environments, talking about the enterprise environment. So it's very easy. So you have an infrastructure, you have on the ground, and we're now basically taking that infrastructure, throwing it into space. Now, in a data center, I can walk in there, I can touch an object, I can reboot a server, I can do that quite easily. When it's in space, that's quite a challenge and a mission to be able to, you can't do your hands-on, you can't walk up there and change the, you can't change the cryptographic keys just because you think someone might have compromised. So what I'm doing is taking another line, which is normally I'm a bit lost. I'm not talking with slides. I'm trying to do this without slides. So bear with me. Normally would be sort of saying that you have a security operations center of some description. You would have incorrect phrase. In space terminology, a SOC is a space operations center. So I mustn't get my words mixed up. You'd have a cybersecurity operations center. You may also have a network operations center, mission operations center, an enterprise operations center, lots of different areas of information. What I've actually done in the UK is actually to draw a big line through all that and say, actually, we're not doing that anymore. Shock horror. What we're actually now doing is a SOC of SOCs. So all the information will aggregate together into a cybersecurity operations center. So when we're talking about, is the platform performing correctly? Now, how do you know in your use cases the platform is operating appropriately? And I need the metrics of, is the temperature increasing? Are the applications offloading and loading appropriately? Is the camera releasing its information as imagery? Did the transmission to ground happen successfully? And did we get a signal back from ground saying it's been successful? Whether that be over STT&C or whether that be over laser communications, I don't mind which way it goes, just has the communication been successful and be able to sort of make sure the information comes back appropriately. And with, as we mentioned previously, LEO satellites, flying at 500-600 kilometers an hour across the Earth's surface. In the US, so 550-ish miles an hour across the Earth's surface. It doesn't pass at the same rate as the Earth passes. So with those items flying around very quickly, it's the ability to actually, can you get a sustained, strong communication link, get the information down to Earth as fast as you can, and build prioritization around it. So when you have critical information, so the platform is not responding appropriately, you think something is compromised, it's getting those messages down to Earth first and worrying about the other messages later. So that's the sort of approach we're sort of taking in the sort of delivery within the UK. And we've learned a lot of lessons from what's happened in the Ukraine war. And on the supply chain side, we've learned a lot of lessons there. And being part of the SSIE, the Space Security Information Exchange, we've been able also to actually look at our supply chain through the through the central government in the UK and identify, and we've had actually some purchases would have been quite damaging because we almost purchased some Chinese cameras that we would not have been able to load in the spacecraft and would not have been able to utilize. That saved us nearly £4.5 million worth of mispurchasing. So it's a case of just make sure you actually have those sort of lines in place. So that's where my sort of position comes from. And I'm obviously very passionate about sort of the space industry. Lots of areas and lots of anecdotes we can go on to, but I'm obviously greater to have a conversation around the panel. So I'll hand back to yourselves. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Neil. So as you all are thinking about questions to ask, I'm going to get us started here, take chair's prerogative. So first of all, I think, Melissa, something that you mentioned that is really important is we oftentimes think the cyber domain is something fundamentally different. But I think something that you hit on that's really important is concerns about information assurance and information security are much older. Thinking about electronic warfare prior to the cyber age, part of the information networking age. So I wonder if you can start us off with some comments on what is there to learn from prior priorities on information assurance. If we look at US concerns going back to the Cold War about the vulnerability of information systems to electronic attack, what can we import? And then also what is different?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So I think there's a variety, we could do this all day, so I will sort of limit myself a little bit. So I think there's a variety of things to look at. So one is the set of priorities is very, very similar. So our end states that we're hoping to have are identical, right? Which is like the confidentiality, the integrity, the availability of data or systems in those areas. So that ports over really, really nicely. I think the other things that port over really nicely, and to be clear, this does not mean we have solved these in previous spaces. I think sometimes when we say port over lessons, like, oh, we'll just port over the solution set, we're still having these problems in cybersecurity kind of land as well. Another one is sort of thinking through the kind of responsibility models and the architectures and how we sort of risk assessment and how we lay out who does what in terms of cost. I'll give you an example of that. So one of the things that's sort of front and center, not just that these are very remote, that you can't necessarily access them in the way that you might necessarily want to, but these are also a horizontal. So space systems are not in and of themselves. They are providing a service for some other critical infrastructure, some other function. So they're kind of in this middle ground, which means that when you're looking at the ability to have visibility into your threat and your risk model, which is something we historically look at in ICS or in any cybersecurity conversation, a lot of that visibility sits with the provider of that service, right? Whether they are kind of across that supply chain or simply providing as a service or kind of a more traditional model in that space. That's a problem if you're trying to assess your risk as a downstream customer, right? What does it look like? And you're seeing these conversations, for example, out of Space Force and Space Command in the United States. What is the risk when you're relying on commercial satellite systems for 45%, let's say, of your communications, which is about the level we saw in Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and satellite commercial systems. That's a little bit of a black box because you can have information about where sort of vaguely what your data look like, but what happened to your data, exactly how that data was secured, that's a partner conversation we're currently having with cloud, right? Which is like I'm moving a significant portion to my kind of data, my activity to a third party. What is the responsibility model and how can I get visibility on that when I'm trying to assess my risk or trying to problem solve? That's a one-for-one conversation that we could look for. I think other sets of conversations that are incredibly useful, like rules of three, right? These are basic resiliency principles that we can port over. Rules of three. Another way to be very, very helpful that I think we don't always talk about is redundancy, which is not even a rule of three. So as we're looking at mission critical systems that you cannot afford to lose, there's a question of, let's say this is sitting in Geo, for example, can you replicate for mission critical in Leo? And if not, do you have a non-space based solution for those assets? Like those are high cost scenarios, but we're very accustomed to thinking through those risk landscapes in this space. And then a lot of the other conversations we're having move away from patching life cycles, don't put your security up front by design. We can't sort of patch Tuesday over and over in these systems. It shouldn't be necessarily as reactive to actively breaking things, which is a component that we haven't been even as keen to do in ICS systems, which is like break your system so that you understand how it breaks and how you're going to recover. You don't want to do that when you have a 20-year asset. Like now I will break my system at high launch cost, high visibility cost, high industry cost, high government regulatory cost. We want to be able to model those things effectively on the ground. So I think there's actually more things that port than we think don't. And the like very specific technical way you achieve that may be different, but the same priorities, we could drop a lot of this language, right? Like dynamic link libraries, which we're just talking about. Please know what's in your libraries. Open source code, all of these are conversations we have in other spaces. So slightly different flavor, but a lot ports.
Neil, perhaps you can comment, especially bringing in your perspective from your prior position with our UK Foreign Office with information assurance and thinking about how we can bring in lessons from other areas of information assurance specifically to the space cyber nexus.
Yeah, absolutely. So taking the approach from sort of giving a UK steer on this, I'm a big standing. I've been standing on this for quite some time, and I actually have been sort of pushing it through both in the private sector and in the commercial sector, in the government sector as well. The requirements to not think about single element, single components part of your information assurance loop. What I tend to do now is try and go for approach, and the tone that I'm using now is total enterprise security, or TES, is the approach we're taking, which talks about the information assurance around the satellite, spacecraft. So people will say, okay, I'm going to make sure your platform secure. I'm going to make sure that perhaps your communication links are secure. Somebody else might be looking at ground stations. Somebody else will be looking at the data centers or your cloud offerings once you've got the information on the ground. And then other people will be talking about where the actual information gets used at the end user terminals, etc. What I've done is drawn a great line around the outside of all of it and said everything falls inside the information assurance window. So whether it be as any of those spacecraft, ground communication, etc., if one of those elements hasn't been secured by design, hasn't got the total security and assurance around it, the weakest link will fail your system. And that's how your hackers and your insider threats will actually sort of mitigate. So we'll actually be able to activate and actually you take compromise of the platform. We used to in the UK have everything was risk based, and it was they used to have this terminology IS1, IS2, and it was EAL this, EAL that, to know what the level of assurance and accreditation was. That model I've thrown out the window. It's basically now, what is the totality of the system and what is the weakest element? What is the lowest common denominator here? And the lowest common denominator is where I start my risk from. Taking the risk approach it's understanding also the threats that it's the risk appetite of the client. So if I'm dealing with commercial clients, their actual ability to think about risk appetite, well, they're probably bothered more about confidentiality, availability rather than confidentiality. Whereas if I'm talking to governments or military ones, they'll be looking at availability and confidentiality. It's putting the different parts of the triad together to make sure you get the platform balanced. And what we don't want to be doing is over-engineering. So when we're actually trying to develop something, actually, can we afford to lose that platform? So can we build in redundancy in a different way? So when I've been having conversations with OneWeb, who is the UK equivalent of Starlink, their way of building in resilience actually is they're built in 10% redundancy into their spacecraft. So if they lose 10% of their infrastructure, they can still operate at 100%. And it's how you actually then manage that and do inter-satellite communications to keep your platform running. And yes, as previously mentioned, so back to yourselves.
Thank you, Neil. And Gil, given that Israel has had a long history of working on cybersecurity, has a very robust governmental cybersecurity apparatus, and also a long history of collaboration between the government and the private sector, what do you see as some key lessons that can be imported from the Israeli context, looking at information assurance to the space cyber nexus specifically?
So I think that, or with your permission, I would like to reframe the question, because when you mention Israel, there is a very interesting process that started just recently in Israel, and which is to building a space ecosystem, pretty similar to what Israel did with cyber, and building a cyber ecosystem and position itself as a leading state in cybersecurity. So the government started a similar process, that its goal is to establish more private space companies in Israel, and to build this kind of ecosystem. And I think here the risks are, which is not lessons to be learned, but just to take into account, is when you want to encourage more space startups, for example, their business model is very different from big and established space companies, and then the issue of security by design will not always be their first concern, because getting profit and getting the product ready would be in higher priority than the security issue. So I think it relates to what Neil and Melissa mentioned, that I think all the issue of risk management and the importance of supply chain risks, and especially for the space sector, are very important, but different companies will address them in different ways. Like startups will address these kind of issues probably they will less prioritize them than space contractors, for example, for that working with the US government. So I think that the question of risks should be taken into consideration, but given the differences between the countries or the companies, sorry. So and specifically, I think lessons specifically from Israel, I think as Melissa mentioned, I think there are all the risks are common risks. I don't think we have, like, Israel has something unique in that sense. But I do agree with what was mentioned earlier, that we should not address the issue of cyber risks to space infrastructure as something that is completely new. I think that everything that Melissa and you mentioned that are important and relevant to when we talk about cyber, and we have to see how to address these issues when it comes to space, but it's not something that is completely new.
All right, thank you, Gil. So now we'll open it up to you all and also to the audience joining us by Zoom. Anyone? Yes.
Maybe a slightly obvious question, but I've only arrived in this area of study recently. But where in the overall hierarchy of threats to space-based assets do cyber threats kind of sit? Just to kind of contextualize what we're talking about.
This is a really great question. So I think one of the things that's sometimes missing, this is why I really like this question, that is sometimes missing from this conversation. It is true that as the systems we deploy evolve and become increasingly complex hardware, software creatures, both at the ground level and in the space-based asset level, that they are increasingly susceptible to cyber operations. This is a truism, right? It is a truism that I think we were a little late on the pivot to sort of recognize. And there's been a lot of, I think, a truism that there's been a little bit of hand wringing, like, oh no, and then even more recently going, maybe we should think about this systemically, not just at different sort of organizational industry level, but as a sector, as customer bases, right? So there's this conversation, US should be critical infrastructure, all critical infrastructure at the space-based component, right? So thinking it through at all of those levels. So that is very, very true. It is also really true that cyber operations are not the only tool at your disposal if you want to disrupt communication systems, right? So there are still a significant number of sort of terrestrial components here. It's not a coincidence that, for example, we would target bridges where fiber optic cables lie in times of conflict, right? Where you're looking to sort of shift groups off existing communication lines into potentially more insecure communication lines or cripple communications in general. That is also true in cyberspace and in space-based assets. So there's a whole set of kinetic tools and there's a whole set of cyber tools. So a lot of the logic about why you might use cyber operations, I think it is important to recognize we have a bit of an iceberg effect. So for every biosat, there's been a series of other incidents that we don't talk about that are not available in the public space. So we tend to use biosat because it is so publicly available. This is very, very true. But if you want sustained impacts, a sustained effect to guarantee that a certain form or infrastructure on communications is disabled for a period of time, cyber operations are not an amazing tool for doing that, right? And that's like for anyone who's been in sort of any cyber operations conversations, they're not a Swiss Army knife. It's not like maybe I'll bomb it, maybe I'll cyber it, right? Like, and those are equivalent things that you can just sort of choose to deploy. There's a lot of constraints in the cyber kind of domain to how you would do that. You need to have a really detailed knowledge of the system in a way that you don't if you're putting sort of metal on target in the same way. You may not be able to, depending on your sophistication, scope your effects as clearly as you might have wanted to do. You may have contagion concerns as it spreads across other ecosystems. You may get the effect, but not in totality, or not when you were hoping, or not long enough, right? There's a strong persistence component, which was like, if you wanted that effect in the first place, you needed to have been in network for a while, right, to be able to do these things at scale. So there's a whole set of reasons why cyber operations are not necessarily the best tool if your goal is just cripple communications. There's a lot of other tools that we have at our disposal. They're particularly helpful for espionage, as we've seen in a variety of these spaces. And they're also particularly useful if your hope is to use that infrastructure on the other side. You don't want to blow something up Which is something we see in Ukraine, if your hope was to be able to occupy some of those territories and leverage the communication infrastructure that you see in place. But a lot of the logics are the same, right? So why would you go after satellite communication for Ukraine? You're doing it at the same time as they're jamming. It's not just a cyber operation. So targeting Viasat, jamming, and shifting, I think the goal to sort of cellular communications, which at that time were deemed to potentially be less secure. That's like a very familiar strategy. So if you looked at World War I, World War II, go after fiber optic cables, right? Go after undersea cables, shift your communications to less secure components. But I think your question is spot on, which it's not like decision makers are going, shall I blow this up? Shall I cyber this thing? It's not always that.
So just following up to that, Neil, I was wondering if you could comment for all of us on some of the distinctions between EW and cyber threats. So when we think about Ukraine, we oftentimes hear cyber attack thrown around and talking about certain space systems, when in reality we're talking about electronic warfare attacks. And of course, there's a very important relationship between electronic warfare and cyber activity. So I was wondering if you could disentangle all of that for us and perhaps provide some amplification on which of those you see as perhaps more urgent.
Certainly. So just following on from the comments on the previous question, one thing we talk about and everyone gets hung up about focuses on is relating to disruptive attacks, where you are looking for an effect to take place. So example being that you had there on the Ukrainian war effect was basically to attack the ground stations. Attack the modems on the ground and not the actual spacecraft themselves. The spacecraft remained secure. They weren't attacked themselves. It was the ground stations. It was the landing stations, wherever and modems were. That was what was attacked as part of the Ukrainian war. And when we look about the attacks, what we have to be able to be cognizant of and remember is I apologize if this term is not the one you use in perhaps the US. Is we have a term which is known as freeloaders. Do you know that term? Yeah. It's where you have somebody who is basically sat on your platform, using your platform for their own gain. Now, that might not be seen as being for criminal activity. So it's more likely to be for criminal activities rather than to be taking compromise or bringing your system down. But my experience is what people forget about is that we have a lot of people focusing on we must protect the spacecraft, we must protect the payloads, we must protect everything that's in space. If I, as in my previous life working in the Foreign Office, US version of the State Department, if we wanted to cause disruption, I would attack the ground stations. I wouldn't be going after the spacecraft because they're passing over too fast, and it's very, very hard to try and hit a shooting target. In warfare, we would be looking at, say, you go for the ground station, you want to try and do either an intercept. So actually you receive the same communication as that ground station is receiving, and can you actually decode that information and actually read what they're doing from the spacecraft as it's passing over at the same time? Because when it transmits to you and 500 square miles of ground at the same time. So can you receive that and see what they're doing? Can you cause a disruption or an effect to actually stop the transmissions from getting up to denial of service? Can you somehow, as part of your ground technique, if you can work out the ST&Ts and C waves, can you actually stop that communication and the mission information getting up to the spacecraft for them to be able to do the next job? So that's another part of sort of the warfare, is actually how these techniques take place. And we then go the sort of the further extreme, which is to do with sort of electronic warfare, and we've seen examples where China firing a rocket into space to actually blow up a satellite just to cause disruption. The shrapnel that was created, or the fragments that came off that spacecraft, caused the International Space Station to have to take emergency maneuvers to stop it being hit by objects flying at hundreds and hundreds of miles an hour, which would have caused significant damage and ultimately have been loss of life because somebody decided to do something against it. Now, the other sort of side of it to do with sort of attacking or cybersecurity we're looking at the moment, so space security we're looking at the moment, is also people flying spacecraft next to your spacecraft to cause either disruption. So one of the phrases we actually use is electromagnetic warfare, which is actually if you send something up close enough and switch on a strong enough transmitter, can you actually block and actually stop the transmissions going in or out of the spacecraft? we don't build these things. Are very, very lightweight. They're very fragile, and they're not designed to withstand attacks like would do on the ground, like a tank would. So if you can do enough of an EM emissions, actually electronic magnetic emission at space level, whether that be a blast or whether that actually be a nuclear blast to actually cause and knock these things out, is very common. But the other side of security is natural disaster, which is the things like the solar pulses that come from the sun. When solar flares, you're not going to stop those from happening. And it's actually how can your spacecraft, if it is attacked by one of these or affected by one of these objects, is how you can go through a process of it being able to go through recovery, to restart, to reinitiation, to actually reigniting itself, to actually try and get itself back online. And all those sort of factors need to be built in. And the critical thing is, can you get back to a gold image where you know you're at a good known baseline standard and restart the spacecraft? And can you get the spacecraft to do that for itself if it hasn't heard from Earth for a long period of time? Those are things what needs to sort of factor in as part of the process. Hopefully that answers your question.
No, thank you, Neil. And Gil, what are your thoughts on the most vulnerable parts of the space architecture?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear you.
If you could comment on the most vulnerable parts of the space architecture, thinking the space segment, the ground segment, what you see as the key vulnerabilities, and potentially ways to mitigate those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, so I think the way I see it, and I definitely agree with Neil, I think the weakest link is when humans are involved, and the easiest place to start is where we can find most humans, which is in the ground stations, and even in a way of kind of insider threat kind of tactic, you know, just to make one of the engineers or employees to enter a USB or take some information out, you know, and these are very simple techniques which are not unique just for cyber, right? It's as Melissa mentioned, these kinds of like inference techniques are way old, and I think that is the getting this kind of access is or let's say by getting this kind of access, the attacker can get much more, and then it can try to damage the link segment and the spacecraft itself and the satellite and everything. But I think a good place to start or to focus the security would be where humans sit and work.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you a question on that,
Oh,
actually. So since you're also an expert on intelligence, I was wondering if you could talk about this personal security piece.
Yeah.
Because we've seen very recently in the US government, even though we spend all of this money on cybersecurity, which is of course very important, there's also the personnel security aspect of not just cybersecurity, but security writ large. And so Neil mentioned these LinkedIn invitations. LinkedIn has probably been one of the largest boons for foreign intelligence services, especially for folks here in DC that like to put exactly what security clearance accesses they have for public consumption. And so I'm just wondering, what is the personnel security aspect of this look like? Where does that fit into the broader array of threats under this heading of information assurance and cybersecurity?
Yeah, not to throw LinkedIn under the bus, but you are not wrong in the sense of sort of not just their personal security clearances. A friend of mine who works on kind of red teaming is making the comment, if you're looking at an organization trying to figure out what their terrain looks like, the first thing he does is go to LinkedIn and see what all of their engineers are certificated for and the languages they say they were. And they say, they're running XYZ. I'm going to target, like, boom, I already automatically know their terrain. I didn't have to breach, I didn't have to have any initial entry to know that. So you're not wrong. The more we share, the sort of more vulnerable we are. I wonder, I'm actually going to jump on something Neil said and then answer your question. So we'll play a little bit of dodging here. I think the first bit that I wanted to emphasize that I think is a useful framing for this broader conversation is we're having sort of three conversations in parallel. And one is sort of what is the utility of cyber operations against space systems, whether it's ground systems, uplinks, downlinks, space-based assets, or the customer user bases that rely on them. And there's a broad conversation there. There's a broad conversation about, given kind of how that might take place, what are the weakest links across that? So like very on each of these stages, and I think they're 100% right. Ground stations traditionally are actually what you see a lot of these incidents focusing on, and what a lot of our exercises focus on. And then the last piece is, what do you do about it? And we're having sort of three conversations there. One is the prevention. How do I just prevent activity? This is like, I don't want to see it. So can I deter, right? Like, what are the sets of pieces there? Ransomware, which sort of Scott emphasized very early on. There's been a strong international push on ransomware to sort of deter ransomware operators from targeting critical infrastructure. So much so that you recently had an operator who ended up in critical infrastructure and like tried to back out as quickly as possible. It's like exit stage left. Like, my bad, I didn't realize this was critical infrastructure. Like, you can have it back because this sort of international community is coming down with a back of bricks. There's a prevention conversation. There's importantly a mitigation conversation, which is like, what do you do in the moment to maintain as much functionality as possible? And there's been a series of examples both Gil and Neil have pointed to there as well. And then the last is like, how do I come back up, which is the recovery component. And those are three actually different processes and different policy solutions. So just sort of emphasize those. Personal security and a sort of series of leaks in this component. So Gil is not wrong. Traditional, speaking of all lessons being relearned, the weakest link is often humans in a space. That's not necessarily just because of sort of the ground station having a lot of people, but also the ground station is a brain functionality for the broader cluster. But it is true. I mean, the still most common initial entry in networks is spear phishing and phishing, which just sort of requires you to click on something, or if you are sort of trying to avoid that set of tools, even social engineering around sort of how to best package those assets. A bunch of Iranian threat actors are particularly good at that component. So there's a strong human piece here. I think there's an interesting side of this conversation that's not even necessarily about human security, but it's sort of the how we know what we know about a lot of this conversation. So if you don't have a clearance or you are not privy to a lot of these components, a lot of the visibility we have at the moment is through things like leaks, right? Looking at these kind of most recent Discord leaks, front and center, there's a strong human insecurity component to that, right? Like good visibility on sort of Chinese programming, sets of concerns around Chinese programming as well. But that's sort of not a new set of problems, but it's an interesting thorny one as we're in this space. Like, how do we talk about this, having this debate with myself? How do I talk about some of the things we know the United States is doing, Five Eyes are doing, adversaries are doing, when the visibility we have of that that's public facing are leaked documents?
Other questions? Scott?
Well, risk of posing a statement rather than a question. You can shut me down. One of the things I think in terms of the most dangerous part of satellite system, space, ground, or the links, I would say from a system engineering standpoint, it's the interfaces. So interfaces between hardware and software, interfaces between the operating architecture and say your partners. Like our weakest link in many international space systems is that of our partners, who we want to partner with, we tend to partner with, but they themselves, have weaknesses in them. And so the very nature of the way we structure civil space cooperation certainly is with foreign partners, but how strong are they? With regard to system interfaces between hardware and software, there's a lot of talk these days about going to digital twins for modeling things. But I remember an earlier technique, which was ironbirds, that you build an iron version of the satellite, complete layout, and you would run what software you had primitive in those days sort of on it to try to drive and simulate what is going on. And so I think as we try to build cybersecurity into our hardware and software systems, the failure points are going to be at those interfaces. I think number one is humans. I agree completely with that. But after you get past humans, then it's going to be those interface points with others or within your own system. And how do we build simulations that allow us to find and pinpoint those techniques? So I think while we have these new capabilities of digital twins, older techniques, such as ironbirds, are going to have a comeback. The question I would want to pose, though, for personnel security is, how come we don't hear as much about our friends and allies having the kinds of leaks that we do? What are they doing better than us? Are they simply suppressing those stories better? Or is there something else going on? If I adjust on a per capita basis, the US seems to be overperforming in terms of the number of traders that it has. So what could we learn from our Israeli or British friends?
So, Neil, I'm going to throw that one over to you. Just to add on there, what Scott said, I think one key data point here too is not all of our Five Eye partners use polygraphs, for example. Not the British. That's been historically, I'm talking way back in the Cold War, that was in contention at times, how we do these different personal security practices. So, Neil, any perspective you can provide on perhaps UK approaches to this issue and maybe some lessons that could be learned on this side of the pond?
So I think it's a very good point about personal security. One thing I would say, coming from having held the highest clearance in the UK, is everybody has a price. I don't care who you are. You can be the president of the US. Everybody has a price. It may not be financial, it may be something else you may want to go after. So they may go after your families, but everyone at some point have a price and they can become compromised. Betting, which is what we do in the UK, is only as good as the day your vetting was last done. So when you do your vetting, we have a term in the UK which is called MOT, which is what your car gets every year. They say your car's now fit to go on the road. That doesn't mean as soon as you drive out the garage, you can't sit there and change all the tires. You can't swap the engine out. You can't do other things to make that car not fit for being on the road. Just that at that time when it was assessed, it was fit for purpose. And the same thing for people and vetting. Your vetting is basically a stop point. What we very much do in the UK is we look for a culture of, it's not called, I wouldn't say whistleblowing, but we go through continual assessment. So every year we have to do an annual resubmission to basically say that you are still fit to hold that particular level of vetting. In addition to that, your people and your colleagues around you monitor you. So if you start having conversations or things start to change, then you are obliged to actually highlight that, actually bring that to the attention of management. It's one thing we do. We do have compromises in the UK, and we have had them. I just don't think they've quite made the tabloids in the US or overseas. We've had a big problem within policing. I don't know if you've heard about that, where we've had people who have been senior police officers who have gone through vetting and they've ended up being killing people. It's only through actually you sort of looking at it, the due diligence, to actually realise that the vetting processes they went through weren't good enough, and that's actually now being stepped up. So we do have problems in the UK, and it has happened. It's just maybe not hit the press over in the US. Regarding some intelligence leaks, we have very, very robust auditing and protective monitoring in place. So when accessing intelligence reporting, etc., especially when the information comes from the US or one of the Five Eyes partners, everything you do, that piece of intelligence is monitored. So how long you read it for, which computers you were on, when you printed, etc. So it goes through a great deal of due diligence, and that came out of the lessons learned from when we had the problems with Snowden. And the Five Eyes got together to actually basically say the Five Eyes, which is Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, and the UK, got together to say, well, how can we stop this happening again? And we have learned a lot of lessons from that, and we've implemented those across the UK to try and make it more robust.
Thank you. And Gil, perhaps you can bring an Israeli perspective, thinking specifically about Unit 8200, Israel's roughly NSA, US Cybercom equivalent. Either Unit 8200 has some of the best security, or perhaps the Israeli media has not been as forthcoming about any kind of security breaches, but we would certainly appreciate your views on how Israel has approached this issue of personal security, specifically in the information assurance cybersecurity realm.
Sure. So something that I would like to connect your question, I think, to maybe a broader issue, and then I'll give the Israeli perspective. So in the past few years, we've been seeing many countries, and especially, as you mentioned, the US, being more public generally about cyber attacks that they suffered and cyber attacks that they did against others. And one of the questions is, or the issue that raises is the US is doing that a lot. And then we ask who is doing that too, right? And for example, Israel is not doing that. Israel is not revealing, hardly reveal information about cyber attacks that that it did, but it's generally relates to a broader ambiguity policy. So this kind of policy is related to not only to cyber, right? To cyber, to intelligence operations, to kinetic attacks. Israel has a long-standing ambiguity policy that, you know, neither confirm nor denies. So this is the Israeli side. And one other thought I had on your question is that sometimes states can benefit from this publicity. So you ask why we don't see why we see the US doing that and not other countries, but sometimes saying something like I've been cyber attacked, but I managed to deal with that and to strengthen my defenses and along the lines that Neil mentioned after the Snowden links. I think states can benefit from this kind of publicity. So it's not only a bad sign if the US is the one that is doing that the most.
I think there was another question.
Yeah, so we talked about the fact that it is well known that the amount of actors and the variety of actors in space has gone up demonstrably. But at the same time, a lot of those actors have both been in the civilian or commercial sectors as in the military sectors. And those are sometimes the most likely targets for these cybersecurity attacks. We can see that in Ukraine, we can see that in many other situations where we don't have a fine line between the assets that are required for everyday people and then those that are required for military assets. So I was hoping to understand more about what are the consequences of that and what would it take to shift that into a more fine line.
Melissa?
Yeah, this is a great question. On just like plotting us back to the leaks, and then I'll take your question. I wish I could say I knew everything about why leaks happen in the US architecture. I think the best, like if you're looking to follow someone who has the most nuanced take on the current leaks, Professor Thomas Ridd, a colleague of mine at Johns Hopkins University, Johns Hopkins SAIS, I think has the most nuanced examination so far that I'm seeing sort of like public facing on why leaks happen and how we should interpret them and sort of where they go. So I would follow his work. He has a series of things out already and has a sort of forward-leaning presence. So follow that. I kind of defer to him as sort of the bellwether in that space. I think this comment though about how do we determine what's a military asset versus a civilian asset is not new to space, but is increasingly a problem in space-based systems. So this is the same issue if you're looking at just cyberspace in Ukraine, right? So the best visibility, I'm going to sort of make a statement that some of you may be like, no, but I'm going to say it anyway. The best visibility in terms of what's happening in cyberspace in Ukraine is coming from big platform companies, right? It's Google and the Google Tag Report, it's Microsoft and the series of their reporting. And the reason they have incredible telemetry to rival some signals intelligence, to actually rival most, if not all, signals intelligence agencies in that space is because it is their terrain upon which that activity is occurring, right? They are the owners, operators, front line of defense, providers of that terrain, which means that often when you're looking at cyber operations targeting what we would consider Ukrainian infrastructure, it is leveraging private sector actors to do that. So that's like a front line in terms of visibility and responses in their follow-up. So does that make Microsoft a combatant? That is front and center, right? A kind of a question. And it is true, there is a series of international kind of players, tech players in this space that take very seriously their customer base in Ukraine, both as sort of a customer base and also potentially a broader geopolitical set of concerns, and are very forward-leaning, sort of how they think about their responsibilities there. The same thing happened with satellite providers, right? So I know for a fact there were discussions as sort of the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine looked like it might kick off about sort of who's going to be able to use your assets, right? Do you want to know exactly what your customer base is using them for? Do you want to be responsible for providing sustained sort of connectivity on those assets if they kind of reach certain conditions of very high tension? There's front and center of the conversation. I think we talked a little bit about Starlink and SpaceX and repositioning of some of those assets. That's a lot of dependence on a single provider that sort of a variety of customer bases, including somebody this year trying to help pay and support. It's a single provider, right? It's like a civilian facing technically infrastructure. So this double dipping, I think, is front and center. And I think it's a problem both in terms of how we think about norms, how we think about governance and prevention conversations in times of peace, as well as in times of conflict, because these are the terrain upon which these fights are going to happen and the visibility is going to happen. But I wish it was as simple as, well, like anything far right here, clearly you're in the military space, and anything below this, clearly you're not. But like, this is a very kind of familiar and deeply disconcerting problem that you see in cyberspace as well. And it's one we're still grappling with, but it's not sort of as easy as just saying, no, if this is a private company, there should be nothing untoward happening on those networks, period. Like, those are the terrain upon which military communications travel. These are the architectures along which government networks sit. These are the architectures along which critical infrastructure sits. And there is a distinction between times of war and times of not war. So sort of like thinking those pieces through.
Thank you. So Neil, the British government has been dealing with this problem of dual use information infrastructure going back in the 19th century, with British submarine cables. So what is both UK government perspective on this issue of distinguishability? And now that you're working with industry, what's the UK industry perspective, especially as more companies, more commercial actors are providing capabilities to the government, various governments, as we've seen in Ukraine, they could potentially be targeted.
So casting my mind back to about 10, 15 years when I was first looking at sort of when we're doing data centers and rolling those out, everything had to be UK sovereign, everything had to be on premise, everything had to be ours. And if we couldn't touch it and see it, we didn't trust it. That's the position we used to be in government. Spin forwards to the current direction from the UK government is it's cloud first. So everything now is being off premise, is being sent to a third party provider, and the only denotable element we're putting around that is you're sort of saying, okay, does it need to be a UK cloud data center, or can it be an EU one, or can it be a US one, depending on sort of the level of information we're sort of holding, depending on where we sort of sit in the platform. So we've taken a position, obviously, in government to understand that Microsoft would have a lot more damage reputation to think about, and they're the ones that are going to be faster with the patching. They're going to be more cognizant about the threats from people coming in to try and penetrate the platform, because if it got compromised, it would be very bad for them. So actually moving that risk across to them, it actually moving that across to them, it actually makes a lot more sense for the less sensitive information. When we then flipped forward to looking at the space sector, I put my other hat on, which is to do with where we are in the commercial space and with the platforms we're building. Now we are building true dual use platforms, which is something which is totally unique. Whereas previously it would have been a case of, no, this platform is only for military capability. This is only for policing. This is only going to be used for commercial work. That separation now has gone because the total cost of ownership needs to be reduced. And certainly with the cost of doing space programs, UK government can't afford to have a 500-600 satellite constellation running to be able to deliver their capability. Whereas we can look at then leveraging someone like Starlink or OneWeb and actually say, okay, can we use them as an information bearer? And what can we do to protect our information as it passes and transits their network to make sure it's still protected? So can we double wrap it, for example? So can we actually wrap it inside UK cryptographic standards and then transmit it over the OneWeb network? Yes, you can. We have a saying in the UK is, I will pass top secret information around Costco car park. I don't care where that cable's been, so long as it is encrypted and protected appropriately. And that's what we need to be able to do going across the satellite network to satellite infrastructure.
Thank you. And Gil, perhaps you can finish this off in our last few moments here on this issue of distinguishability and also dual use nature of these information systems and the challenges associated with that.
Yeah, sure. So I completely agree with what Neil said, and I think the trend that he mentioned that happened in the UK is something that happened in all around the world, and with the new space more than a decade ago and everything, and the more and more countries and companies started to rely much more on private manufacturing and try to find cheaper ways to operate in space, and that raises the question of the dual use, as you mentioned. And I think this is something that we also, it's a question that we also think about when we think about cyber operations. If sometimes we see, like, for example, in the SolarWind hack, we saw an operation that some described as information operation, and some described as a potential cyber attack. So I think this question is a like cross-domain question, and I think this is something that a lot of thought needs to be put into it when we talk about cyber threats to space systems.
Right, well, thank you. Well, thank you all for being here today. Perhaps a round of applause for our great panelists. Very much hope to see you at future SPI ISTP events. Thanks and have a good day.